Have you ever felt a creeping feeling of invisibility? For me, it came when a sports shop assistant ignored me while serving all the much younger people around me. He just didn't see me. As a woman in my 50s, I wasn't on his radar as someone he needed to give his attention to. It was both puzzling and infuriating. Today we're talking about age beliefs, in particular our beliefs about women over 50 and how ageism, including our own, can get in the way. And we're asking the question, what's age got to do with it? I'm Sue West. Welcome to Flourish After 50. Today I'm joined by Joanna Maxwell, an expert on age discrimination who spent 7 years working on this topic for the Australian Human Rights Commission, researching and responding to ageism in Australia. She continues to be a member of the New South Wales Ministerial Advisory Council on Ageing, and following the success of her book, Rethink Your Career in Your 40s, 50s and 60s, she's working on a new book about living our best lives as we age. Joanna, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
One of my greatest pleasures about doing this podcast series is reconnecting with various people I've met in the last couple of years who I've really drawn a lot of wisdom from, and I get the opportunity now to share that with others. So you and I reconnected earlier this year at a university forum in Melbourne where you facilitated a really lively workshop on the topic of what's age got to do with it. And it's this topic that I want to talk with you about today. So ageism probably impacts most closely to women over 50 in terms of how others see us and how we see ourselves. And for women who are carers of ageing parents and relatives, how they see those older people in their lives as well. So what first got you interested in ageism?
I guess my first encounter with ageism was through clients. I spent a number of years, 15 or 20, before I joined the Human Rights Commission, working with people who wanted to change their careers. And as I got older, I started attracting older clients. And I was fascinated to hear their stories and to start to realize that their experience of job seeking or changing job careers was different to younger people, and also that for women it can be different than it is for men. And so I started researching that. I got so interested in it. I did a second master's degree in older workers and social change and ended up joining the Human Rights Commission, which was a total treat for the 7 years that I was there.
That experience that you described with your clients has really been borne out in the most recent research about the attitudes of HR professionals, managers, recruiters who consider 51 plus to be older workers.
Yes, I was involved in that survey for 3 or 4 of its iterations while I was at the Commission. And it's always interesting to see the prevalence and the comfortableness that people have in disclosing this. There's no sense that this should be hidden. They're quite comfortable in saying, no, we wouldn't hire people over 50, or we regard that as old in the workplace. And that shifted a bit over the years I've been involved in this field. I do think there are some signs of better practices for older workers, both men and women, but it's still a thing, unfortunately.
In the intro, I talked about my experience in the sports store of feeling ignored, which had everything in my mind to do with my age. How does that experience resonate with you and what you know from the research about experiences of ageism?
Yeah, and I think every woman listening to this over a certain age, sadly probably somewhere in their 40s, can resonate with this. And yes, it's to do with getting older, but it's also to do with the intersection between gender and age. So I've personally, in my master's degree, done quite a lot of research on what is called gendered ageism, which is the double whammy or more than double whammy that happens for women as they age, because they're still subject to sexism. And now we've just added age on top of it. And so that can result in them being judged in ways that men are never judged. And it comes back to A lot of those ideas of women being put in much more rigid boxes to do with attractiveness, childbearing, caring, youthful, put them on pedestals, that whole line of ways of looking at women. And as women age, for people who see women in that way, they become a bit useless or unnecessary or unimportant. And then it becomes really easy to just ignore them. And I think in some cases actually not see them at all. I had a similar incident to yours in a sandwich shop where I was trying to get served. And in the end, a man had to say, "Excuse me, this woman has been here for 10 minutes and she's been waving at you. Have you not even seen her?" And the assistant looked really startled, but I think was kind of thinking, no, I had no idea she was even there. So it can be that simple and that unattractive, really.
So when we meet someone new, what 3 things are we most likely to quickly and unconsciously become aware of?
Yeah, I always talk about this because I think it's fascinating that we are actually hardwired when we meet a brand new person to notice their gender, their racial or cultural background, and their age. And when we notice that, that's fine. It's hardwired. You can't help it. You generally just have that flash of, oh, okay, so they're an older woman or they're young for that role or whatever. It's when you start putting judgments and feelings around that it becomes more problematic. So one of the things I think is most fascinating about stereotyping older people or younger people for that matter, but for older people, we actually become more different from each other as we age, not more similar. So it becomes less and less useful or accurate to assume that all people in their 70s, for example, are the same, when in fact we're much less like each other than all people in their teens or their 20s. And so I think that's a really useful reminder.
I'm so fascinated by that. I've been sitting with this question for myself about, what are the common experiences of people in their 50s and 60s. And when I thought back about what was happening for me at 50, I had a 9-year-old child, and I hear others talk about 50 as being, the period of empty nesting, and I was in the trenches. So I appreciate what you're saying about the diversity that exists amongst 50, 60, and 70-year-olds increases over time. So how do you define ageism?
I tend to like the United Nations, the World Health Organization definition because it's clear and captures ageism across the whole lifespan. And that is basically how we think, how we feel, and how we act towards other people or ourselves based on their age. So if we think that's sort of that hardwired stuff I was talking about a little while ago, we can't always help what thought pops into our mind when we first see someone. But how we feel becomes judgments and prejudice, and how we act becomes the behavior of discrimination. And those two particularly are highly problematic.
And so can you say a little bit more about why our age beliefs matter so much?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you've got beliefs about all sorts of things. I have beliefs about, I don't know, tofu. I don't understand tofu. As far as I'm concerned, it's a complete waste of a food group and I don't get it. But that doesn't matter to me or anybody else. I just choose not to eat it. But what we believe about age really matters. And we know that from some very solid research that says that people who have positive beliefs about their aging, positive sense of meaning and purpose as they get older, and a positive sense of who they are likely to live much happier lives. They're likely to live much healthier lives, but they're also likely to live 7.5 years longer than people who don't have positive age beliefs. And the other thing with age beliefs is that we know that they rub off very quickly. And so it's really important that we become aware of our own age beliefs and of the beliefs of people around us so that we can kind of put up a resistance to buying into when you're ignored in a shop. It's very easy to think, oh, that's because I don't matter anymore. And it's really important that we don't go there.
So what are the strategies, or practical strategies, women can apply in their own lives to this challenge?
It's very easy to put it on, let's say, older women themselves, that it's up to us to change it. And it is up to a point. But these attitudes are also systemic. They're in the health system. They're in the retail and hospitality system. They're in the education system. And I think to expect that women themselves can change that is difficult. I think it takes away responsibility from where a lot of it belongs. But in terms of actual individuals, we can start rejecting some of the messaging. We can start thinking about, well, how do I actually feel about that? And what do I want? Do I feel healthy enough to go off and do a gym class, which is what I'm going to do as soon as this podcast finishes? If so, then perhaps don't listen to the messaging from my friend who says, oh, no, you're too old for that, or whatever. We can also start watching our language. I think a lot of ageism is transmitted very easily through language. So there's language people use to us. So I'm now nearly 68, so I'm very familiar with this, where people will call you love or pet or talk to you in particular ways. And it's very easy then to just internalize that. And that becomes what we call self-directed ageism, where we buy into the stereotypes that people are putting on us. And if you become aware of ageism as a process, you can then start to sense check, I guess, that, and to reject or question. So if a doctor says, well, there's not much we can do, you're just old, which sadly is something that does happen quite a lot. If you don't buy into that straight away, you can say, well, if I was younger, what would you do? And why can't I have that? Or, again, in my case, I have a dodgy knee, and it's easy for people to say, well, you've reached your late 60s, of course you've got a dodgy knee, but my other knee is fine. And so clearly that says it's not just a process of aging. I have injured one knee and it needs attention. And so I think that's a really good place that individuals can start.
Can you tell us a bit more about the forms that ageism takes?
We know quite a lot about ageism. 20 years ago, we didn't so much, but there has been a great deal of research now. And it's become very clear that ageism takes a number of forms, and that it is somewhat different for men and for women, for older people and younger people. So the way that in my field we would break this down is to say, as I've already mentioned, that there is systemic ageism, and that's ageism that is baked into some of our institutions, the health system, the education system, government policy making, financial decision making. You try and get a credit card after 65, it's almost impossible. There's also interpersonal ageism, which is probably what most people would think of as ageism, which is ageism that happens in conversations or between a doctor and a patient. So one-on-one chats or messaging we receive about anti-aging creams, and we take them on board. There's also the final kind is internalized ageism, which is when we take systemic ageism or interpersonal ageism, things we read or see, and we start almost unconsciously to believe that they're true, that these wrinkle cream ads mean that we actually need to get rid of wrinkles, that they're not a natural, happy part of life, whereas in fact, of course, they are. They're perfectly natural and a sign of a life well lived, as far as I can see. And so that's the kind of structural differences in ageism. But for men and women, it's also different. So you touched on right at the beginning that sense of invisibility that happens very strongly for women in their 50s and certainly by the time in their 60s or 70s. And that, I think, is tied to how we treat women throughout their whole lives. Women are far more judged on youthfulness and attractiveness than are men. So as women age, we often find that they are portrayed much more as frail or dependent, unattractive, useless, that marginalizing of women. Whereas, and these are themselves stereotypes and generalizations, but they have some truth in them, that men are much more likely to be seen as wise or experienced or quirky or interesting as they age than women are. And so I think that's a major difference that's worth drawing out.
It's really interesting to think about that even for myself. So I turned 60 last year, and I'm very publicly talking about aging in really positive ways and quietly having a meltdown in the background about turning 60. And, really, essentially, that is because somewhere deep in the recesses, I'm holding on to these ideas for myself about age and what it means. And that it was a really challenging time.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, isn't it, to watch this process in ourselves. And to me, it just highlights the universal nature of ageism and our own humanity. I mean, I've been in this field for over 20 years, one way or another, and I still catch myself having little ageist thoughts. Or, when I was running a series of workshops a couple of years ago, we had to do half online and half face-to-face. And I found myself saying to my colleague, we're going to have to find some young tech guy to help us with the online workshops. And the second I said it, I thought, this is crazy. This is me just spouting a stereotype about people who are technologically competent or incompetent. And the second I said it, I laughed, caught myself. And in fact, we ended up hiring a woman in her 60s who was brilliant to help us, just the perfect person. But it shows that we really have to be very gentle with ourselves in terms of believing in things like, I also realized a couple of years ago that I was the oldest employee in my workplace. And I had to either give myself, like you were saying, having a private meltdown, I had to give myself a real talking to about what does that matter? I'm the same person I was yesterday.
Yes. Yeah, the struggle is real. And I guess that it is exactly what you're talking about in terms of the views and attitudes that exist in our society and the challenge of those being internalized and needing to tackle them.
And it's a really good reason to question things individually. We may not be able to change the whole world, but we can certainly change our willingness to kind of buy into outdated and inaccurate attitudes if we think that's not actually true.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, one of the things that really drives me with Flourish After 50 and the work I do with women and this podcast series. And it seems to me that one of the opportunities is to be creating more and more stories and positive stories of aging and how we can live our best lives as we age. And that's the focus of your new book. Is there anything about that you're able to share with us at this point?
Yeah, the fact that it's not really very written yet. It's getting there slowly but surely. But to take your wider point, I think it is really, really important that individually in our conversations, in our work, encouraging our society, our media particularly, to publish, to share stories of actual real women. I don't want made up stories or exceptional stories, but the many, many stories of real women in their 50s, 60s, 70s and beyond who are living full, exciting, happy lives. And that gets to things like representation of women on TV shows, representation in the general media, like why when a female person has an accident, they're always described as a mother, whereas when a male person has an accident, they're almost never described as a father of three. There's lots and lots of things that are starting to be questioned that I think is a really good place to start pulling threads to untangle some of this.
So you alluded to the fact that this is systemic, that this is a responsibility of all of us to do something about. I've also heard you say that of all of the prejudices, ageism is, there's some quick fixes. Can you tell us about that?
It's interesting to compare it to some of the other prejudices like, say, racism or sexism, because ageism is arguably, pretty strongly arguably, the most tolerated and socially accepted of all the prejudices. We think nothing of making old fart jokes or buying people a birthday card that talks about them being over the hill at 50 or whatever, in a way that we would never do for the other prejudices these days. But it's also, as you've just said, the easiest prejudice to break down. And that's because when we realize and think about ageism, it's going to happen to all of us. If we are lucky, we will all live long, happy, healthy, purposeful lives. And so it's really a prejudice against our future selves. And once people realize that, it is surprisingly quick to break down. We did some research at the Human Rights Commission that suggested that people's attitudes towards older people, and this was in a marketplace where people were working with older people in, say, residential aged care or community care settings, their attitudes would shift quite quickly once they had this broken down a little bit and once they realized that this was all of us. It's not just the other person. It was very encouraging.
And very hopeful, really, I guess, hearing those results. So are there positive signs that people are tackling these issues here or overseas, Joanna?
I've certainly noticed in the time I've been involved in this field that things are changing. It's a bit piecemeal, and some of it's, for example, just one company that bans the use of the words anti-aging on their beauty products. That's really helpful, but we need lots and lots more than that. There's also, I've noticed, many signs of many workplaces that are now being much more active in rooting out stereotypes, in hiring, in promotion, and that includes older workers and also older women workers, and that's encouraging. So one of the things I think is really important as we start to dismantle ageism is that we don't buy into what is known as successful aging. So there's a body of media stuff of the way some people talk about aging that preferences people who do extraordinary and fabulous things, like a man in his 90s who gets a PhD, or Nana jumping out of an airplane to celebrate her 80th birthday. These things are all terrific, but they're not actually relatable to most of us. We're not going to do either of those things. But I think it's important that we start to see a lot more images, stories, because storytelling is really important here. A lot more accounts of normal, average, older people who are aging day by day in a way that works really well for them. They're living their best lives in a normal environment. And I think if we had more stories around it, that more characters like that on television, that would be incredibly helpful.
Yeah, that really resonates for me when I think about my looking for photographs to put on my website of women over 50. It was really challenging to find women doing a full range of things in life. And I know that there's a group in the UK that have, in order to address that, have created a data bank of photographs of people in their 50s, 60s and 70s just doing regular stuff at the work, at the park, doing gardening, in the shopping centres, and just getting about regular life, really.
Yeah, I use that photo bank as well. I think it's terrific. And it's exactly the kind of thing that we were talking about, of having normal, positive representations of older people, older women doing normally resilient and fabulous things, because, older age is a terrific time of life and it should be celebrated in that way, but in a very average sense. Not, I have one photograph of a couple on the beach with a bicycle, and I often use it to point out the pitfalls of successful aging or positive aging. And these two people have you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Very coiffed hair and beautiful. She has beautiful makeup, and he's got a little pink jumper tied around his neck, and she's got little shorts on, and they're with this bike on the beach. And apart from the fact that anybody our age knows you can't ride a bicycle on a beach, it's a really unrealistic picture for most of us who are probably never that gorgeous or rich or into pink jumpers. And so we need the pictures you're talking about, both pictures and stories of people who, are just living normal but good lives.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. So if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about how society views women over 50, what would it be?
I read an article in one of the major Australian newspapers a couple of weeks ago by a woman journalist busting negative myths about older women in Australia. And it was a really terrific article. But after I'd finished it, I thought, hang on, there's something missing here. Busting the negative stereotypes and saying older people are not necessarily frail or incompetent workers or whatever is terrific. But we also need, and if I had a magic wand, I would make sure that the world was sprinkled with stories of older people living resilient, happy lives. We know that as we age, we become happier, we become wiser, we know what we want. And for women particularly, we stop caring about what others think, which I think is a marvelous bonus as you go through.
I was going to say, hell yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we read these messy but joyous, exciting, interesting stories about older women, not just busting the negative ones, if that makes sense.
Yes, it absolutely does. It absolutely does. Joanna, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your story with me today on Flourish After 50. Joanna's work continues in New South Wales, and I'm sure you'll be involved in other organisations and advisory committees bringing your expertise to the world. And when your book's published, I would love to know about that and perhaps interview you again at that time and share the information about that through my newsletter and network and make sure that we all hear about it.
Thank you. And it's been such a pleasure having the chance to talk about this stuff today. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Flourish After 50. If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to follow in your favourite podcast app. I offer coaching and facilitate small group programs for women just like you and have a newsletter where I share the details of upcoming events. All the links are available in the show notes. Until next time, keep exploring, keep growing, and keep flourishing.